Okay, let us go through question number 21. It says, a Mule application is designed to fulfill two requirements. So in one Mule application, there are two requirements. Processing files asynchronously from FTPS server to backend database using VM intermediary queues for load balancing Mule events. Okay. So as per my understanding, I understand that they have a flow with FTPS endpoint to poll for files from FTP server and asynchronously process the files. That means transforming the data coming from file into list of records, pushing them into VM queues. And then from VM queues, they are listening by using VM listener. And here there's a logic to write to database. This is one requirement. They have one flow like this. And second requirement is processing medium rate of records from source to target using batch job. So they are having batch job also in their application. Considering the processing reliability requirements for FTPS files, how should VM queues be configured for processing files as well as batch job scope if the application is deployed to two workers? Okay, so uh, how VM queues should be configured? So of course we know here we are using VM queues as it is deployed onto two workers, worker 1, worker 2. If we are using persistent queues on Cloud Hub, if the queues are made as persistent queues on Cloud Hub, these queues will be persisted by using something called as Amazon SQS in the backend. They'll be persisted. So as there are two workers and if you are using a persistent queue, the load will be distributed. Whatever messages coming into this queue will be processed by both the nodes. Load will be distributed. So enabling persistent queues will be good as the application is deployed to two Cloud Hub 1.0 workers. And you have batch job. So in batch job, of course, as you know, there will be a record queue. So do you want record queue to be persistent? So according to documentation of Mulesoft, I will point you to the documentation. Mulesoft recommends that applications containing batch component do not use Cloud Hub persistent queues, right? So there are some issues running. Batch process will execute uh, up to or more than 10x faster without Cloud Hub persistent queues because there is an overhead of persistence and network. Using persistent queues will not give good performance. So disabling persistent queues for batch job is a good idea. So that is a question actually. So uh, the options are use Cloud Hub 1.0 persistent queues for FTPS files processing. Okay. And it says there is no need to configure VM queues for batch job as it uses by default workers disk for VM queuing. No, this is not true. Actually, in batch, there will, if you go through the documentation, I have clearly seen somewhere by default, Cloud Hub persistent queues are used. Um, how to use Cloud Hub persistent queues for an application that contains VM queues and is a Cloud Hub Fabric multi-worker deployment and uses batch. See, here they are saying disable Cloud Hub persistent queues for batch. Therefore, batch job will use local file system based persistent queues on a worker. How to disable? This is the way to disable. By default, this configuration is false. Persistent queues are enabled in batch by default. You have to manually disable it. So this option is not correct. The second option, which says there is no need to configure VM queues for batch job, this is not correct. The second option, use CloudHub 1.0 persistent VM queues for FTPS processing. Okay. Disable persistent VM queues for batch job. This is correct. So what is the third option? Use VM connector persistent queues for FTPS files processing. No, you have to use CloudHub persistent VM queues. Okay. So among all, this is a correct answer according to me. Okay. Next. An organization is creating new services that are critical for its business. The project team prefers using REST for all services, but is willing to use SOAP with common WS standards if a particular service requires it. So the question is, what requirement would mandate the team to use SOAP/WS star for particular service? So one of the requirement is SOAP supports message acknowledgement, but whereas REST does not support message acknowledgement. And retries are part of one of the WS standard of SOAP. So if these are the requirements, suppose if you want a message to be acknowledged and if you want a message to be retried as part of protocol, then SOAP is better than REST. See, retry we can do manually when you are using REST, but in SOAP, one of the WS standard will have retry as part of protocol. If this is your requirement, then they can design SOAP web services. This is the correct answer. I'm very confident. Next, a corporation has deployed multiple Mule applications implementing various public and private APIs to CloudHub workers. Okay. There are a lot of APIs deployed on CloudHub, public and private APIs. These APIs are critical applications that must be highly available and in line with reliability SLA as defined by stakeholders. They should be reliable and highly available. How can API availability, that means liveliness or readiness, be monitored? So ops teams receive outage notifications. Actually, to test the reliability and high availability, any point functional monitoring can be used. So I have opened the documentation for any point functional monitoring. The documentation says API functional monitoring is a framework for assuring quality and reliability of public and private APIs that are being used in application network. Is this a similar kind of statement here? They're having public and private APIs and they want reliability and high availability. So the API functional monitoring framework is a framework for assuring quality and reliability of public APIs, right? API functional monitoring solution enables developers and operators perform consistent testing of functional behavior and performance of their APIs throughout life cycle in testing and production environments. Actually, you can write test cases using API functional monitoring. But my understanding is, I have read through the entire documentation. There is no way to create an alert using functional monitoring. All right. Uh, so I thought this might not be a correct option using any point functional monitoring to test APIs, because using functional monitoring there is no way to create alerts. They asked in the question, they want to actually do liveliness probe or readiness probe and monitor, but also they want to receive outage notifications. So notifications cannot be achieved using any point functional monitoring. So I thought it is a wrong answer. And I thought configuring alerts with failure conditions in runtime manager was good. But how do we test reliability? All that is not possible with alerts. But then I again looked at the documentation. Somewhere they say that you can integrate functional monitoring with some third party tools. Let me just point you to that. Uh, you can get reports on results of monitor execution. You can also set up integration with a number of monitoring and issue tracking systems. So as this point is mentioned, maybe we can integrate this functional monitoring. As functional monitoring generate reports, we can integrate these reports with some other monitoring tool which can generate alerts. So considering all the facts, I feel that this option is more appropriate. Configuring alerts with failure conditions, we can just get notifications, but we cannot monitor the performance. So among all, I feel that this is the correct answer. Okay, next question. An organization is designing multiple applications to run on Cloud Hub in a single anypoint VPC that must share data using persistent object store. So running multiple Mule applications in a single anypoint VPC that must share data using common persistent anypoint object store. So for multiple applications, they want a common object store. Normally, if I'm using object store connector, the object store connector will have a separate object store. We'll use a separate object store for each application. But the requirement is there are multiple applications and they want to use a common shared persistent object store v2. Which design gives Mule applications access to same object store instance? What is the first option saying? Okay, this is space actually. A VM connector configured directly to access persistent queue of persistent object store. Oh, persistent queue and persistent object store, they are not related. This is not at all a correct answer. Second option says object store service v2 REST API configured to access persistent object store. Yes, object store v2, there is a REST API. In your code, you can access that REST API in your code. That is correct answer. Another option is object store v2 can be shared across cloud hub applications with configured object store v2 connector. No, if you are using object store v2 connector, it will use a separate object store for each application. It will not be shared. So this is not correct. And the last option is talking about anypoint MQ connector. No, this is also not correct. According to me, using object store v2 REST API in all of your applications will give you a common shared persistent object store. This is my answer. Okay, among all the other options. Next, Point uses Mulesoft Cloud Hub and develops APIs in latest version. Okay, when analyzing requirements for one of the APIs, integration architect realizes that another third party API must be called. The security team has made it clear that any external API needs to have include listing. Okay. So calling any external API needs include listing. That means from Cloud Hub, if they want to make an outbound call, so whenever you are running your application on Cloud Hub, you are inside a VPC. Inside this VPC, there will be a virtual machine created and your application is running here. So if your application needs to make a call to an external API, the URL of this external API has to be configured, has to be included in a list. Okay, that is what security team is saying. If a URL is not listed, then outbound call from this VPC will not be allowed according to the firewall rule configuration. Okay. How can an integration architect finish the design plan to support these requirements? Okay. What is the first option? Implement the validation is included listed IP operation. So in the code, this is saying that write a validation so that it validates that include listed IP operation is done. Oh, validation component is not correct. Implement a proxy for the third party API and enforce the IP include list policy and call this proxy from the flow of the API. Okay, it is asking to implement a proxy for the third party API. So through the proxy, the calls have to be made. Okay, another implement any point filter processor. No. Implement the include IP list of Cloud VPC firewall to allow the traffic. Implement the include IP list on Cloud Hub firewall to allow the traffic. So whatever REST APIs are needs to be accessed, their IPs have to be added in the include list IP when they are configuring the Cloud Hub VPC firewall. According to me, this is what is required. Okay, when they are configuring the Cloud Hub VPC firewall, they have to allow the list of IPs to which they want to make external calls. Yes, this is the correct answer. Okay. Okay. We'll see the next question in next video. See you in next video.